July 14th, 1976. The body of Alan Pocock, 57 years old, Drainage Board Commissioner for the Huntsville and Brew Internal Drainage Board, was found on the bank of the King's Sedgemoor drain at 6:40 in the morning by a willow cutter making his way along the Rhine bank toward the cutting ground he'd been working since Monday. The King's Sedgemoor drain was the largest of the Somerset level's arterial drainage channels, a straight cut of water 12 feet wide and 6 feet deep, running 17 miles from the uplands above Bridgewater southeast toward the River Brew. The channel maintained by the Internal Drainage Board under the Land Drainage Act 1930, and the instrument by which 40,000 acres of reclaimed peat moor were kept productive rather than seasonally flooded. Alan Pocock had been the commissioner responsible for the drain's maintenance schedule for 11 years and had been found face down in the reed bed at the drain's eastern bank with injuries to the back of his head that the Somerset Constabulary's attending officer noted in his initial report as inconsistent with a fall and consistent with a blunt instrument applied with force. The summer of 1976 was the driest in England since records began. The drought that had started in the spring of 1975 reaching its peak intensity in July 1976 with temperatures above 90 degrees for 17 consecutive days, and rainfall for the preceding 13 months, running at 40% of the historical average for the Somerset levels. The levels in normal years were a landscape managed against water, because the low-lying peat moors between the Mendip Hills and the Quantocks, sitting below sea level across much of their extent, and dependent on the network of rhines and drains and pumping stations that the drainage boards maintained to move surplus water off the moor and into the tidal rivers that carried it to the Bristol Channel. In the summer of 1976, the problem was reversed. The peat drying and cracking and contracting, the rhines dropping to levels that exposed their banks, the farmers whose fields were crisscrossed by the drainage network, watching their pastures turn from the rich green of the reclaimed moor to the pale straw of drought-stressed ground, while fighting simultaneously over the one resource the drought had made scarce enough to kill for, which was water. Or the King's Sedgemoor drain, in the summer of 1976, was carrying approximately a third of its normal flow, the water table below the levels having dropped far enough that the upland catchment was contributing a fraction of its usual input. The drain still held water, more than the surrounding rhines, more than the field ditches that were dry from their banks to their beds across much of the central moor. The farms along its eastern bank, in the parishes of Moorlinch and Sutton Mallet and Stowell, had riparian rights to draw water from it for livestock. The farms along the western bank, in the parishes of Westonzoyland and Middlezoy and Chedzoy, had the same rights. In a normal year, those rights were exercised without conflict because there was enough water for both banks. As in July 1976, there was not enough water for both banks, and there had not been enough for 3 months, and the conflict over who drew how much from where had been building since April, with the particular intensity of disputes between farming communities, where the same families had worked the same ground for generations, and where the water that kept the ground productive was as fundamental as the ground itself. The Internal Drainage Board was the legal body responsible for managing the drain and arbitrating between the competing riparian rights when they conflicted. Alan Pocock, as the commissioner for the eastern section, had been the man the Eastern Bank farmers came to with their complaints, and he'd been the man making the allocation decisions that had, since April, consistently favoured the Eastern Bank's farmers over the Western in the distribution of the drain's reduced flow. He'd done this with the administrative justification that the Eastern Bank farms were of larger acreage and carried more livestock, the allocation formula under the Land Drainage Act weighting riparian rights to acreage and stock numbers, and with the personal investment of a man whose own farm at Moorlinch sat on the eastern bank, and whose own cattle were drinking from the draw he was authorising, the Western Bank farmers had been protesting this allocation since May, had attended 3 board meetings, had written letters, had retained a solicitor in Bridgewater who'd written to the board's legal adviser questioning the allocation methodology. The solicitor's letter had produced a response from the board that confirmed the allocation formula's application and offered a review meeting in September, the September timing being, in July 1976, as useful as an offer of an umbrella to a man already drowned. The Western Bank farmers had come back from the 3rd board meeting in early July, knowing the formal process was not going to produce anything before the drought broke, or their livestock began dying, and had gone back to their farms, and had a series of conversations that the Somerset Constabulary was eventually going to reconstruct from the accounts of 7 people, none of whom agreed on exactly what had been decided, and all of whom agreed that something had been decided. The man at the centre of those conversations was a farmer named Geoffrey Grinter, 49 years old, who ran 400 acres of beef and dairy at Westonzoyland, the largest farm on the Western Bank, a broad and deliberate man whose family had farmed the Westonzoyland levels since the 17th century, and who had a particular relationship with the Somerset landscape that the older levels farmers understood, and that newcomers to the moor found difficult to read. The relationship of a man who knew every rhine and drain and pumping station for 10 miles in any direction, not as infrastructure, but as the accumulated work of generations that had made the ground what it was, and whose defence was not a matter of choice, but of continuity. Geoffrey had been at every board meeting, had been the primary signatory on the solicitor's letters, had been the farmer who'd measured the flow in the King's Sedgemoor drain at the eastern and western offtakes every morning for 3 months, and recorded the discrepancy in a notebook that his solicitor later described as the most meticulous piece of evidence he'd seen in a water rights dispute in 30 years of practice. He'd measured a consistent differential of between 15 and 22% more, water being drawn by the eastern bank offtakes than by the western, a differential that exceeded the allocation formula's permitted variance by a margin he'd had the solicitor calculate, and that the solicitor had put in the letter to the board's legal adviser as evidence of allocation exceeding entitlement. The board had not changed the allocation. Pocock had not changed the allocation, as the differential had continued through June and into July as the drain level dropped and the differential's absolute impact on the Western Bank farms increased, 15% of a full drain being a number, and 15% of a near-empty drain being cattle without water. On the evening of July 13th, 1976, Geoffrey Grinter and 4 other Western Bank farmers had met at the Westonzoyland farmhouse, the meeting lasting 3 hours by the account of Geoffrey's wife Edna, who'd been in the house throughout and who'd brought tea at 9, and noted that the mood in the kitchen was the mood of men who'd exhausted the options they found comfortable and were discussing the ones they didn't. She told the Somerset Constabulary's Detective Inspector Roger Marsh this in her first interview, the telling direct, and without apparent awareness, that she was describing the prelude to a death, the directness of a woman who'd been raised on the levels and who didn't disguise things that had happened because the habit of disguise was for people who had something more to lose than she did. Alan Pocock had left his farmhouse at Moorlinch at 5:30 on the morning of July 14th, his wife Dorothy noting the time because he'd woken her when he left, the early start unremarkable in a farming household in summer. He'd told her he was going to walk the drain bank before the day's heat made walking uncomfortable, a habit he had 2 or 3 times a week in summer, the drain bank inspection giving him both exercise and the first-hand assessment of the drain's condition that he considered essential to his commissioner's function. He'd gone out through the kitchen door in his working clothes, boots and canvas trousers and a checked shirt, carrying nothing, and had been found 5 hours later by the willow cutter in the reed bed with his head broken. The willow cutter, a man named Stanley Vickery, 61, who'd been cutting withies on the levels since he was 15, had gone to the nearest farmhouse after finding the body, and from there the call had reached the Bridgewater police station, and from Bridgewater Detective Inspector Roger Marsh had driven the 6 miles to the King's Sedgemoor drain bank at Moorlinch in the police car he shared with the 3 other detectives of the Bridgewater CID, while arriving at 7:10 to find Vickery sitting on the bank 50 yards from the body, with the composed stillness of a man who'd found bad things before in the course of working landscapes, where bad things occasionally happened, and who was waiting with the patience of someone who knew there was nothing useful left for him to do. Marsh was 38 years old, a Somerset man from Taunton, the son of a cider apple farmer who'd grown up knowing the levels the way farming children knew them, as the particular world of water and moor, grass and willows and the flat horizon that made the sky enormous, the landscape that in the drought summer of 1976 had the quality of somewhere under pressure, the peat cracked and pale, the rines low, the air carrying the dry grass smell that was wrong for Somerset in July. He'd been in Bridgewater CID for 4 years, and had come to it from the uniformed section where he'd dealt with the agricultural disputes and boundary arguments, and the occasional serious violence that the Somerset countryside produced, and he understood before he'd examined the body or spoken to anyone beyond Vickery that he was at the intersection of the drain-water dispute that had been building all summer, and a death that had been caused by something other than natural or accidental causes. The pathologist from Taunton, a Dr. Marion Fells, arrived at 9:15 and confirmed what Marsh's attending officer had recorded, the injuries to the back of Alan Pocock's head being produced by at least 2 separate impacts from a blunt instrument, the instrument probably wooden from the wound pattern, of the death having occurred between 5 and 8 in the morning. There was no water in Pocock's lungs. He hadn't drowned, had been dead before his face went into the reed bed. There were no defensive wounds on his hands or arms. He'd been struck from behind, twice, and had died quickly, and had been left where he fell or placed in the position in which he was found, the forensic evidence at the scene being insufficient to determine which. Marsh had driven to the Pocock farm at Moorlinch by 10 o'clock, and spent 2 hours with Dorothy Pocock, a woman of 54, whose composure in the first hours after being told her husband was dead had the quality of shock rather than control, the still surface of someone who hadn't yet understood the full weight of what they'd been told and who was operating on the automatic competence that people in shock sometimes produce, making tea, sitting straight, answering questions with complete attention, while the larger reality settled slowly into the space around the answers. She'd told him about the early morning departure, about the drain bank walks, about the board meetings and the Western Bank farmers and the solicitors' letters, about the differential Geoffrey Grinter had been measuring and recording and presenting at every opportunity. She'd said Geoffrey Grinter's name with a particular flatness that wasn't accusation, but was the absence of the qualification that distance from suspicion usually produces. Marsh had driven from Moorlinch to Westonzoyland in the late morning, the July heat already building toward the day's peak, the drain visible from the road running straight and low between its banks, the water in it dark and still in the absence of the flow that normally moved it. He'd arrived at Geoffrey Grinter's farm at 11:30 and found Geoffrey in the yard, unhitching a trailer, a large man doing a physical task with the deliberate economy of movement that large men who worked hard develop. And that was not the movement of someone who'd been expecting a police car in his yard that morning. Or that was what Marsh noted in his file later, with the careful qualification that his initial assessment of Geoffrey's demeanour was an observation and not a conclusion. Geoffrey had told Marsh he'd been on his own farm since 4 in the morning, starting earlier than usual because of the heat. Or his wife Edna had confirmed this from the kitchen window. His farm hand, a young man named Peters who lodged in the farm's outbuildings, had confirmed seeing Geoffrey in the yard at 5:30. Geoffrey had accounted for his movements to Marsh's questions with the directness of a man who'd anticipated the questions and whose answers were ready. The readiness that Marsh noted without yet knowing whether it was the readiness of an innocent man who'd understood immediately why the police had come and had organized his account accordingly, or the readiness of a man who'd been preparing it since before Alan Pocock's body was found. Marsh had asked about the meeting on the evening of July 13th, and Geoffrey had confirmed it immediately, named the 4 other farmers present, who described the discussion as being about the board's allocation decision and the options remaining to the Western Bank. Farmers, after 3 board meetings, had produced no change. He'd said they'd discussed whether to pursue a legal injunction against the board and whether to approach the County Council's Agriculture Committee, the 2 avenues that the solicitor had suggested as the remaining formal options. He'd said the meeting had ended at about 11 and that the other farmers had driven home. Marsh had asked whether anything else had been discussed at the meeting, and Geoffrey had looked at him with the steady look of a man deciding what the question meant, and had said that they'd discussed the situation in general, the drought and the livestock and the drain, and that it had been a long evening. But he hadn't said no to the question, and he hadn't said what else had been discussed, and the gap between those 2 things was where Marsh's investigation settled in for the summer. If you have followed this far, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This story is about water and land and the violence that communities commit when the resource that makes their land livable is taken from them by the people they've been told to trust with its management. It is about 7 men in a farmhouse kitchen on the hottest evening of the driest summer in English recorded history, and about what was decided there, and about the particular way that rural communities protect their own, and the particular way that detectives in rural communities learn to find the truth inside that protection. Because the Somerset levels in the summer of 1976 were not simply dry. They were a landscape in crisis of a kind that the levels communities understood with historical depth, the reclaimed moors' dependence on drainage management being a knowledge carried across generations, in the same way that the Borrowdale quarrymen carried their knowledge of volcanic rock faces, the understanding that the landscape's productivity was not natural, but made by the drainage work that centuries of levels farmers had done, and that the internal drainage boards had administered since the 19th century. The peat moors of the central levels, the King's Sedgemoor and West Sedgemoor and Curry Moor, were among the most productive grazing grounds in the southwest when managed correctly and the most vulnerable to mismanagement, or the thin margin between productive and flooded or productive and drowned in drought, depending entirely on the competence and fairness of the drainage administration. The history of the Somerset levels was a history of drainage disputes, the records of the courts of sewers that had preceded the internal drainage boards, containing centuries of argument between eastern and western bank farmers, between upland interests and lowland interests, between the men who wanted to drain faster and the men who wanted to drain slower, between the farmers who needed water off their land and the farmers who needed water on it. The disputes were usually managed within the administrative framework of the boards, the formal mechanisms of allocation and arbitration absorbing the conflict before it reached the point of violence. In the summer of 1976, the formal mechanisms had been tried and had failed to produce the adjustment the Western Bank farmers needed before their cattle began to suffer, and the point of violence had been reached with the particular inevitability of a process whose formal channels were exhausted. Marsh understood this context because he'd grown up in it. His father's farm not on the levels, but in the hill ground above Taunton, where the levels drainage flows began. And he'd learned as a child that the levels farmers talked about water the way hill farmers talked about land, as the thing that everything else depended on, as the thing that disputes were ultimately about, regardless of what the formal complaint said. He'd taken this understanding into his investigation and had used it to read the community he was working in with more precision than a detective without that background would have managed. The 4 other farmers at the meeting on July 13th were interviewed by Marsh and his constable over the 2 days following Pocock's death. They were Dennis Holly, 53, 200 acres of dairy at Middlezoy; Frank Cridland, 61, mixed beef and arable at Chedzoy; Peter Swain, 44, the youngest of the group, 180 acres at Westonzoyland, adjacent to Geoffrey Grinter's land; and Raymond Burge, 58, 300 acres of beef at Sutton Mallet, which sat on the western bank of the drain further south. All 4 confirmed the meeting. All 4 described its content as Geoffrey Grinter had described it, the discussion of legal injunction and county council approaches, the long evening about the drought and the allocation and the options. All 4, when Marsh asked the same question he'd asked Geoffrey about whether anything else had been discussed, produced answers that had the same quality as Geoffrey's, not a direct no, not a specific yes, but a circumlocution that acknowledged the question without answering it. Marsh had been a detective long enough to recognize coordinated accounts when he encountered them. 5 men describing the same meeting in substantially the same terms with substantially the same gaps wasn't evidence of fabrication, because fabricated accounts tended to be too consistent in their details, the specificity of the false account overreaching the natural variation of true memory. Well, what he was hearing from these 5 men was something different, the consistency of a group who'd discussed how to describe the meeting and who'd settled on what to include and what to leave out, leaving enough variation in the incidental details to sound genuine while maintaining the same structural omission across all 5 accounts. The structural omission was the last 30 minutes of the meeting. Marsh had worked it out from the details they did give him, the tea at 9 that Edna described, the discussion of the solicitor's legal options, the conversation about the county council, all of which the 5 men placed in the first 2.5 hours of the meeting. The meeting had ended, by Edna's account, at about 11. Between the county council discussion, which multiple accounts placed at around 10:15, and the 11 o'clock ending was approximately 45 minutes, that none of the 5 men's accounts filled with anything specific, the accounts each ending with a general statement about the discussion concluding and people going home. Marsh had gone back to Geoffrey Grinter on the 3rd day after Pocock's death and had put this to him, not as an accusation, but as an observation, saying that the accounts he'd gathered placed the formal agenda discussion finishing at around 10:15 and the meeting ending at 11, and that nothing he'd been told accounted for the intervening time. Geoffrey had looked at him with the same steady assessment he brought to everything, and had said they'd talked generally about the drought, about the summer, about farming, the kind of talk that ends an evening meeting when the business is done. Marsh had asked whether Alan Pocock's name had come up in the general talk, and Geoffrey had said Pocock's name had been part of every conversation about the drain all summer. Marsh had asked whether anything specific about Pocock had been discussed, and Geoffrey had said he didn't think anything specific. No. Marsh had driven back to Bridgewater and written in his investigation file that Geoffrey Grinter was either responsible for Alan Pocock's death or knew who was, and that the 5 accounts of the meeting were coordinated to protect the same information, and that the information being protected was what had been discussed in the last 45 minutes of a 3-hour meeting on the evening before a man connected to the dispute at the center of that meeting was found dead on the drain bank he walked every morning. He'd also noted in the file something that he'd observed at the Grinter farm on both his visits, which was a large wooden post maul leaning against the wall of the hay barn, the kind of heavy wooden mallet used for driving fence posts into peat ground across the levels. The maul had been present on his first visit and absent on his second. He'd noted its absence and had noted that he had no grounds to search the farm at that point, and that establishing those grounds was the next priority of the investigation. The Somerset Constabulary's forensic team had been working the King's Sedgemoor drain bank for 2 days and had found, in the reed bed 20 yards from where Alan Pocock's body had been found, a wooden post maul with 2 areas of impact damage on its striking face consistent with the wound pattern on Pocock's skull. The maul was wet and had been in the water, but the forensic examination of the striking face found tissue and hair in the wood grain that the laboratory confirmed as Pocock's. The maul's handle had been wiped, no fingerprints recoverable, but the wood of the striking head had retained enough biological material to establish it as the weapon. The maul had no identifying marks. Post mauls on the Somerset levels were generic tools, the same design made by the same agricultural suppliers for 100 years, available in any farm merchant in Somerset. Marsh had photographed every post maul he could find on the Western Bank farms he was visiting, and had measured the striking faces, and found that the dimensions of the weapon recovered from the drain matched the standard size used across the levels without distinction. He couldn't connect the weapon to a specific farm by its design or dimensions. He'd sent a request to every farm merchant in a 20-mile radius asking for sales records for post mauls in the previous 12 months. 3 of the 5 merchants responded. 1, a merchant in Bridgewater, had a record of selling a post maul to Geoffrey Grinter's farm account in March 1976, 4 months before Pocock's death. The record was a till receipt carbon in a sales file, the kind of record that farm merchants kept for account customers, and that had been found by a 17-year-old filing clerk who'd spent a Thursday afternoon going through 6 months of account receipts at Marsh's request. The Bridgewater farm merchant's sales receipt was dated March 14th, 1976, 4 months before Alan Pocock's death. The till carbon recording the sale of 1 standard post maul, 32-inch handle, 4-pound striking head to the Grinter farm account at Westonzoyland. It was a legal purchase of a standard agricultural tool that Geoffrey Grinter had every reason to own and no reason to explain, and that became significant only in the context of the maul recovered from the King's Sedgemoor drain reed bed and the absence of any post maul from Geoffrey's hay barn on Marsh's second visit. Marsh understood precisely how much and how little the receipt established. It established that Geoffrey had bought a post maul of the same type as the weapon. It did not establish that the weapon was Geoffrey's maul, or it did not establish that Geoffrey had been on the drain bank on the morning of July 14th. It was a thread in a case that needed a rope, and Marsh spent the autumn of 1976 looking for the rest of the material. The forensic examination of the weapon had produced one further piece of evidence beyond the biological material in the striking head's wood grain. The handle, though wiped of fingerprints, had been examined under ultraviolet light and had shown, in the wood at the base of the handle where it fitted into the head, a faint residue consistent with a leather work glove of a type commonly worn by agricultural workers. The residue was insufficient for any specific identification, but it was consistent with the work gloves that every farmer on the Somerset levels owned and wore, and that could not be traced to a specific individual by their generic composition. Marsh had noted it and added it to the file as consistent with the pattern of evidence rather than determinative of it. The investigation had been running for 6 weeks when Marsh received a call from Peter Swain, the youngest of the 5 farmers at the July 13th meeting. the 44-year-old from Westonzoyland, whose farm ran adjacent to Geoffrey Grinter's. Or Swain had called the Bridgewater station and asked for Marsh specifically, and Marsh had driven to Westonzoyland on a Wednesday afternoon in late August to find Peter Swain in his farmyard, with the look of a man who'd been thinking about a decision for 6 weeks, and had arrived at it with the relief of someone who'd been carrying weight he wasn't built to carry indefinitely. Peter Swain was the only one of the 5 men who wasn't a family farmer in the generational sense that Geoffrey and Raymond and Dennis and Frank were, having come to the Westonzoyland farm through his wife's family 11 years earlier. A Bristol-born man who'd learned the levels farming after marriage rather than from birth, who respected the levels communities and their traditions, but who didn't share the bone-deep loyalty to them that the men who'd been born into them carried. He'd sat with his wife in the farmhouse kitchen, his wife present at his request, and had told Marsh what had happened in the last 45 minutes of the July 13th meeting. The legal options discussion had ended around 10:15, as Marsh had worked out, and in the conversation that followed, Geoffrey had said what several of the men had been thinking without saying for weeks, which was that the formal process was not going to produce a solution before their livestock needed water, and that Pocock's personal stake in the Eastern Bank allocation was the problem that the formal process couldn't address, because the formal process was administered by the same board that Pocock sat on. And Geoffrey had said that Pocock needed to understand the real consequences of what he was doing, needed to understand that the Western Bank farmers were not going to accept the allocation that was draining their rinds while filling his, and that the way to make Pocock understand this was to have a direct conversation with him on the drain bank without the formal context of a board meeting. Peter Swain had understood by the way Geoffrey said this that a direct conversation on the drain bank meant something other than what those words meant in a board meeting context, had looked at the other men in the room and had seen in their faces the same understanding, and had said he didn't think that was the right approach. Geoffrey had said he wasn't asking for opinions on the approach. He was explaining what he was going to do, and that what the other men did with that information was their business. The meeting had ended at 11. No one had said anything specific. No one had agreed to anything specific. Geoffrey had said what he was going to do, and the other 4 men had gone home and not called the police. Swain had spent the 6 weeks since Pocock's death living with this, the knowledge of what Geoffrey had said, and the knowledge of what had happened on the drain bank the following morning, and the connection between those 2 things that was obvious and unprovable from what he'd actually heard. He'd talked to his wife, and his wife had told him that living with that knowledge was not something he was capable of doing indefinitely, and that she could see it wearing him down week by week, and that whatever the consequences of telling Marsh were, they couldn't be worse than what not telling him was already producing. Marsh had listened to this account with the careful attention of a detective receiving the first piece of direct testimony in a case that had been built entirely from circumstance and inference, understanding that what Swain was giving him was not confession evidence and not eyewitness evidence, but something in between, the account of a prior statement that connected Geoffrey's intent to Geoffrey's action through the gap of an unwitnessed morning on a drain bank. It was not enough for a murder charge, but it moved the investigation into a different territory. He'd asked Swain why he hadn't come forward earlier, and Swain had said what Marsh had expected: the community, the levels, the loyalty that the other men expected, and that Geoffrey had assumed when he'd said what he was going to do in a room with 4 other men who hadn't reported it. He'd said he'd known that coming forward would end his place in the Westonzoyland community as he'd known it, and that this was a real cost he'd weighed against the other cost, and that eventually the balance had shifted. And he'd said he was telling Marsh everything he knew, and that he understood This placed him in the position of a witness against a man who was his neighbour and his fellow farmer, and who had done what he'd done because the water that Pocock had been taking from the western bank was the water that Geoffrey's cattle and every other western bank farmer's cattle needed to survive a drought that neither the clouds nor the board had been willing to end. Marsh had driven from Swain's farm directly to the Bridgewater station and had written a 4-page summary of the interview and had called the Somerset Constabulary's head of CID that evening. The next morning, a warrant had been obtained, and Marsh had returned to Geoffrey Grinter's farm with 3 officers and had conducted a search that lasted 5 hours and that found, out in the hay barn where the maul had been present on Marsh's first visit and absent on his second, under a loose board in the barn's floor, a pair of leather work gloves with a specific staining pattern on the right glove's palm, and fingers that the forensic laboratory later confirmed as a mixture of weathered wood residue and human blood of the same type as Alan Pocock's. Geoffrey had been in the farmyard when the gloves were found, had been standing with the constable assigned to stay with him during the search, and had watched Marsh come out of the hay barn with the evidence bag containing the gloves with the stillness of a man who had been waiting for this moment since July, and who'd calculated that it would come, and who'd made his decision about what to do when it came sometime in the 6 weeks between Pocock's death and this morning. He'd said nothing. He'd looked at Marsh and looked at the evidence bag and looked at the hay barn, and then had turned to the constable and said he'd like to call his solicitor. The arrest had followed the solicitor's arrival at the farm, Geoffrey Grinter taken to Bridgewater in the police car in the late afternoon of a September day that was still warm from the summer that hadn't properly ended, the drought having broken only in the first week of September, the Somerset levels beginning to recover their colour as the rain came back and the Rhine started to fill, and the King's Sedgemoor drain rose toward its normal level for the first time since April. Edna Grinter had watched her husband driven away from the farm with the composure of a woman who'd known since July that this was coming, and who'd spent the 6 weeks preparing the farm and herself and their 2 grown children for the management of a working farm without the man who'd run it for 25 years. The charges against Geoffrey Grinter were murder, the Somerset Constabulary and the DPP having assessed the evidence as sufficient for the higher charge, given the prior statement reported by Swain, the purchase of the weapon 4 months before the death, the recovery of the gloves from the concealed location, and the forensic connection between the gloves and the victim. The other 4 farmers, Dennis Holly, Frank Cridland, Peter Swain, and Raymond Birch, were charged with misprision of felony, the common law offence of knowing about a serious crime and failing to report it, Swain's cooperation with the investigation having been taken into account in the decision to charge him alongside the others rather than treat him differently, the DPP's assessment being that the charge was appropriate for all 4, regardless of Swain's eventual assistance. The misprision charges were the most legally significant aspect of the case for the farming communities of the Somerset levels and beyond, the prospect of criminal liability for knowing about a crime and staying silent, producing the kind of anxiety in rural communities that understood collective solidarity as a value rather than a liability. The National Farmers' Union had a solicitor at the Taunton committal hearing in October 1976, observing rather than representing, or the union's interest being in the misprision charges and what they meant for the tradition of community loyalty that the Levels farmers considered inseparable from their way of life. The union's solicitor had told a reporter outside the court that the charges raised profound questions about the criminalization of silence in close-knit agricultural communities, and the reporter had written this up in the Western Daily Press, and the story had been picked up by the Nationals and had produced the particular media attention that rural criminal cases received when they touched something that felt larger than the specific events. Marsh had been at the committal hearing and had read the Western Daily Press piece in his car outside the Taunton court, and had sat with it for a moment before driving back to Bridgewater. Understanding that the case had acquired a dimension that cases about water rights and drought and drain banks didn't usually acquire, and that the dimension was about something the farming communities were right to find significant. The question of what obligation individuals had to report crimes committed by people their communities depended on. The question that every rural detective eventually encountered in some form, and that this case was putting in front of the Somerset public with unusual clarity. The trial at Taunton Crown Court opened in February 1977, 7 months after Pocock's death, presided over by Justice Carmichael, a man who'd been on the Western Circuit for 15 years and who understood the Somerset farming communities with the particular knowledge of a judge who'd presided over their land disputes and their livestock arguments and their boundary conflicts, and who brought to this case the same careful neutrality he brought to all of them, making no assumptions about what communities owed their members or what individuals owed the law. The prosecution was led by a QRC named Helen Forrest, 41, one of the few women silks on the Western Circuit in 1977, who'd built her practice on criminal cases with complicated evidentiary structures and who'd been briefed on the Grinter case because the combination of forensic evidence, prior statement testimony, and misprision charges required someone who could manage multiple strands simultaneously without losing the jury. She was precise and direct in the way of advocates who'd learned to establish credibility in environments that were sometimes resistant to it, and who'd found that precision was more effective than any other approach in those environments. She presented the murder case over 3 days, the structure of the prosecution built around the sequence that the investigation had established, the water dispute as context, the July 13th meeting as the point of decision, Swain's account of Geoffrey's prior statement as the connection between decision and action, the purchase receipt and the recovered gloves, and the forensic evidence as the physical chain. She was particularly careful with Swain's testimony, understanding that the jury would be sensitive to the quality of evidence from a man who'd been charged alongside the defendant and whose cooperation had followed 6 weeks of silence, preparing the jury for this by addressing it directly in her opening, saying that the court would hear evidence from Peter Swain, and that Swain's 6 weeks of silence before coming forward was itself part of the story, and that the jury should understand why a man in Swain's position had been silent and why he had eventually spoken, and should weigh his account in that full context. Swain gave evidence for a day and a half, the testimony delivered with the same direct quality that his conversation with Marsh had had. The Bristol-born farmer who'd come to the levels through marriage and who lacked the generational loyalty that had kept the other 3 men silent, describing what he'd heard Geoffrey say on the evening of July 13th, with a precision that conviction in the account conveyed more reliably than any rehearsal could have produced. He was cross-examined by Geoffrey's QC, a Bristolian named Harlow. For most of the second day, the cross-examination focused on Swain's 6 weeks of silence, on the misprision charge that hung over him, on the question of what benefit Swain might expect from his cooperation, and on the interpretation of what Geoffrey had said in the meeting. The words direct conversation on the drain bank being capable, Harlow argued, of a meaning that didn't imply violence. Swain's response to the ambiguity argument was the most effective piece of testimony in the trial. He'd said, in response to Harlow's question about whether direct conversation on the drain bank could simply mean a direct conversation, that he'd been in the room with Geoffrey Grinter for 3 hours that evening, and that he'd known Geoffrey for 11 years, and that he'd understood exactly what Geoffrey meant by those words. Not because of what the words said, but because of who Geoffrey was and what the situation was, and what the look on Geoffrey's face was when he said it. and that if Harlow had been in that room, he'd have understood it the same way, and that the reason the other 3 men hadn't called the police wasn't because they thought Geoffrey was planning a conversation. The forensic evidence occupied 2 days. The pathologist, the laboratory analyst, and a wood chemistry specialist from Bristol University giving evidence about the biological material in the weapon's striking face, the blood type match between the glove staining and Pocock's blood, and the leather residue on the weapon handle. The wood chemistry specialist was the most technically complex witness, and the one who attracted the most attention from the jury. His evidence, establishing that the residue pattern on the weapon handle was consistent with long-term use of leather gloves on that specific tool rather than a single contact, that the gloves and the maul had been used together regularly, which placed the maul in Geoffrey's possession over a period of months before the death. Geoffrey Grinter gave evidence for a day. The defense strategy, having determined that the evidence required him to testify rather than stay silent, the prior statement being the element that silence couldn't address. He confirmed the meeting of July 13th, confirmed the discussion of the water dispute, denied that he'd said anything that implied violence against Pocock. He said he'd meant what the word said, a direct conversation on the drain bank, and that he'd been planning to confront Pocock personally about the allocation the following morning, but that when he'd walked to the drain bank at 6 that morning, he'd found Pocock already dead, had panicked, had left, had said nothing because he was afraid his presence at the scene would be misinterpreted. He said he'd hidden the gloves, not because they were evidence of murder, but because they were a farmer's work gloves that had been in his pocket when he'd found the body, and that he'd been afraid to produce them once the investigation started. It was a coherent account, and it was the account of a man who'd had 7 months to construct it, and who delivered it with the conviction of someone who'd lived with it long enough to have settled into it. Forrest's cross-examination had been prepared for exactly this account, the preparation having involved identifying the single point in the account that was most vulnerable to the physical evidence, which was the location of the gloves under the barn floor. She'd asked Geoffrey why he'd hidden the gloves under the floor of the hay barn, rather than simply leaving them where work gloves were normally kept. He'd said he'd been afraid. She'd asked why a farmer who'd found a body on a drain bank and gone home and continued his morning would hide work gloves that had nothing to do with the death. He'd said again he'd been afraid of how it would look. She'd asked whether he'd put the gloves under the floor of the barn on the morning of July 14th, the day Pocock died, or later. He'd said on the morning. She'd asked what time. He'd said he couldn't be certain. Mid-morning. She'd asked whether his farmhand Peters had been working in the yard that morning, and Geoffrey had said yes. Peters was always in the yard by 7. She'd asked whether Peters had seen Geoffrey go into the hay barn that morning, and Geoffrey had said he didn't know. She'd asked whether she should call Peters to give evidence about his movements that morning, and Geoffrey had said she could call whoever she liked. She had called Peters that afternoon. Peters, 22 years old, had been in the yard from 6:15 on the morning of July 14th, had seen Geoffrey come back from his morning walk at approximately 6:50 and go directly into the farmhouse, and had not seen Geoffrey go into the hay barn at any point in the morning. He'd been in the yard continuously until noon, because the morning's work had been in the yard and the fields adjacent to it, and he'd said he'd have seen Geoffrey go into the barn, because the barn's door was visible from everywhere in the yard, and he'd remember it if it had happened. The jury convicted Geoffrey Grinter of murder after 3 days of deliberation, the deliberation length reflecting the weight of the prior statement evidence rather than uncertainty about the physical evidence, the jury's questions to the judge during deliberation having focused on the standard for prior statement testimony, and the weight to give it when the prior statement was reported by a witness who'd been charged with an offence connected to the same events. Justice Carmichael's direction on this had been careful and complete, the instruction to the jury being that they should assess Swain's account as they would any witness account, considering his credibility, his reasons for speaking and for his earlier silence, and the consistency of his account with the other evidence, and that if they were satisfied his account was reliable, it was evidence they could rely on. Geoffrey Grinter was sentenced to life imprisonment, the mandatory sentence for murder in 1977, with a recommendation from Justice Carmichael that he serve a minimum of 15 years in light of the clear provocation context of the case. The judge's remarks noting that the water dispute and the allocation failure that had preceded the death were not a defense in law, but were a context that the sentencing recommendation should reflect. But Carmichael was explicit that the provocation context did not reduce Geoffrey's responsibility for what he'd done, and that it did reduce the minimum period of the mandatory sentence by a margin that the judge described as the law's acknowledgement that the circumstances in which people commit violence are relevant to the weight of the punishment, even when they are not relevant to the verdict. The 4 misprision charges produced the most discussed verdicts of the case. Dennis Holly, Frank Cridland, and Raymond Burge were convicted, and each received 12 months, the sentences suspended given their ages, their lack of criminal records, and what Carmichael described as the court's recognition that the criminalization of community silence, while legally sound, now bore differently on men who'd lived their entire lives within a community ethic that made such silence feel like loyalty rather than complicity. Peter Swain was convicted and received a conditional discharge, his cooperation with the investigation from late August onward acknowledged in the sentencing as having been materially significant to the prosecution's success. The reaction to the misprision convictions in the Somerset farming community was exactly what Marsh had anticipated from reading the Western Daily Press piece outside the Taunton court 6 months earlier. The National Farmers Union issued a statement expressing concern about the implications for rural communities, and the Western Daily Press ran a leader column arguing that the law of misprision had been developed for different conditions than the close farming communities of the Somerset levels. Letters to the paper ran 2-1 against the convictions on the misprision charges, the letter writers not defending Geoffrey Grinter's violence, but questioning the extension of criminal liability to men who'd stayed silent about something they'd heard in a neighbor's kitchen and that they'd hoped they'd misunderstood. Marsh had read these responses without changing his view of what the investigation had required. He'd spoken to a reporter from the Western Daily Press in the weeks after the trial, not for attribution, and had said that the question of community loyalty was a real question, and that he respected the communities he worked in and their traditions, and that the investigation had nonetheless proceeded the way it needed to proceed, because Alan Pocock was dead and Dorothy Pocock was a widow, and because knowing who had killed a man and why, and choosing silence for 6 weeks, was not a thing that the law could treat as neutral, regardless of how it felt from inside the community. Dorothy Pocock had attended every day of the trial, sitting in the public gallery with the same contained composure she'd brought to her first conversation with Marsh 7 months earlier, the composure that had, by February 1977, settled into something more permanent. The composure of a woman who'd processed the worst of what had happened, and who was attending the trial, not for revelation, but for the formal conclusion of a process that had begun on the bank of the King's Sedgemoor drain on a July morning, and that needed to end somewhere definitive before she could decide what came next. What came next, for Dorothy, was a legal challenge to the Internal Drainage Board's allocation formula that her solicitor filed in March 1977, 2 weeks after the trial ended. The challenge argued that the allocation decisions made by Pocock in the summer of 1976 had exceeded his formal authority under the Land Drainage Act, that the differential, measured by Geoffrey Grinter and recorded in his notebook and confirmed by the board's own flow records, constituted maladministration, and that the board's failure to review the allocation when challenged by the Western Bank farmers through their solicitor in the spring of 1976 had been a failure of the board's statutory duty. The challenge was filed in Dorothy Pocock's name, because she was the estate's representative, and because her solicitor had determined that a challenge in the name of the victim's widow was harder to dismiss without hearing than a challenge in the name of the farmers whose representative had murdered him. The board settled the challenge in June 1977, agreeing to a revised allocation formula that incorporated an independent engineering assessment of the flow distribution at each major offtake, or the assessment to be conducted annually, and the results to be used as the basis for riparian rights allocation rather than the acreage and stock number formula that had been applied since 1930, and that Pocock had applied with the particular bias of a man allocating from a position that the formula didn't account for, which was the position of having your own farm on one of the banks you were allocating between. The King's Sedgemoor drain had been running at normal levels since September 1976, the drought broken by the autumn rains that brought the Somerset levels back to the waterlogged normality that the drainage network spent its operational life managing against excess rather than scarcity. The rines filled, the peat rehydrated, or the grass returned to the rich green that made the central moor, the grazing ground it had been for 1,000 years. Before the 1976 summer had shown what happened when the water that everything depended on was insufficient for the competing claims made on it. Geoffrey Grinter was released from prison in 1992, having served 15 years, the minimum term that Justice Carmichael had recommended, and that the parole board had confirmed. He went back to the Westonzoyland farm, which Edna had managed with their 2 children through the 15 years, finding it as he'd left it in the physical sense, and transformed in every other sense. Or the fields and the rines and the drain the same geometry of water and grass and sky, and the community around it irrevocably altered by what had happened in 1976, and by what Edna and the children had lived through in his absence. He farmed quietly for 12 more years and died in 2004, the obituary in the Somerset County Gazette noting his farm and his family, and his years on the Westonzoyland Drainage Committee, which he'd joined in 1997. The 2 sentences about the 1976 events placed in the middle of the obituary, with the restraint of a local paper navigating the complex feelings of a community about a man who'd done something unforgivable for a reason that the community had never found entirely incomprehensible. Roger Marsh had retired in 1994, or the Grinter case, the most widely discussed of his career, and the one he was most often asked about in the interviews he gave to criminal justice researchers and historians of policing in his retirement years. He said consistently that the hardest part of the case hadn't been finding the evidence, though the evidence had been hard, but understanding the community well enough to know where the fault line ran, the line between the men who'd been born into the levels and the man who'd come to it from outside, and who didn't share the specific weight of the loyalty that had kept the others silent. He said that Peter Swain had been the key, not because of what Swain knew, but because of who Swain was, and that identifying which person in a closed community carried the lightest weight of its specific obligations was the most important analytical judgment a rural detective made, and the one that formal detective training didn't teach you, and that the landscape taught you instead, if you paid attention to it long enough. The Somerset levels today are managed by the Environment Agency and the internal drainage boards under legislation that has been revised multiple times since 1976. The allocation frameworks and the conflict resolution mechanisms substantially more robust than the system that produced the summer of 1976's crisis. The King's Sedgemoor drain still runs from the Mendip uplands to the River Brue, still the arterial channel that 40,000 acres of reclaimed peat depend on, is still the long straight cut of dark water between flat banks that the willow cutters walk in the early mornings of the level summer. The reed bed where Alan Pocock was found, where the drain curves slightly east of Moorlinch, has grown back over the years the way reed beds do, the specific location indistinguishable now from the rest of the bank, the water moving past it, carrying nothings that remembers what happened there in the driest summer England had seen in a century. This is Dark Chronicles UK. Subscribe for more stories from England's hidden landscapes. And remember, in the Somerset levels, as in every closed community, the truth about what happened is always known by more people than the ones who tell it, and the detective's work is not to find the truth, but to find the person for whom the cost of silence has finally exceeded the cost of speaking.